Number 1. A few years back, I decided to get a divorce after a long, sad marriage. I moved into a tiny house in the backyard of a man who posted an ad on Craigslist. It was in the town I grew up in, so I felt at ease for the most part when I moved in. It was a beautiful setting, and my landlord was very kind and gave me plenty of privacy. He owned a gigantic, tiger-sized bull mastiff that protected the house, and also began to be protective of me too. He was so large that I could barely look him in the eye because of my fear of dogs. I adore animals, but have had a fear of dogs ever since my childhood friend was bit in the face. My nerves were often on edge from the divorce, and also losing my father, and often felt uneasy living alone for the first time in 25 years. There were also a few incidents that happened nearby that made me feel nervous about the neighborhood. One night I woke up at about 3:30 in the morning to what sounded to me like a man crying. I couldn't quite tell where it was coming from. The tiny house was set on the back corner of the property, so I had 3 neighbors behind me. There was a tall fence, so I never knew who lived back there or met them. My place was sort of in a gully, and sound traveled in an odd manner. The crying and wailing continued, and then I heard the man start whimpering and saying, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to hurt you." He said it over and over as he cried and wailed. It was so scary that my blood ran cold, and I was frozen in fear. The tone of his voice seemed so unstable that I thought he may be under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or so emotionally distraught that whoever it was might be a loose cannon type personality. I laid in my bed and could not move and tried not to make a sound. I listened. The crying continued, and it would sound close outside my window, and then become more distant, like he was walking around. I still could not tell if he was in my yard, the yard behind me, beyond the fence, or one of the other properties around the house. The crying and whimpering continued, and then I heard a shovel. He was digging in the ground. It took me a moment for that to sink in. I thought to myself, there was a person outside, digging a grave. It was probably after 3:30 a.m. now. I tried to get up and look out the window, but I was so scared that I thought if the man was in the backyard, he might see the blinds move. So instead, I wedged a chair under the doorknob and found my metal club. I called 911 and whispered to the operator what was happening outside. I explained where my little house was located on the property, and told her that it sounded like somebody had killed someone, and the killer was digging a grave. I could hear the distinctive sound of a shovel hitting the dirt and the rocks over and over, amongst the cries and apologies. The operator said the cops were on their way. After what felt like a week, I saw flashlights through the blinds and heard indistinct talking and commotion. Then I hear, "Freeze!" I heard more talking and crying, and then I hear a man call out my name, loudly. It was my landlord. He came to my door crying and knocked. He repeated my name and was apologizing. "He's dead, he's dead," my landlord cried. "Sativa is dead. He laid down and never woke up." My landlord's dog, that gigantic beast, had died in the middle of the night. I was so scared and sad and still stunned from the trauma that I had to process it for a few minutes. I don't think I'd ever been so scared in my life, and now sadness came over me as I hugged my landlord. The cops were standing around in the grass watching. I heard them making a few comments about digging a grave in the middle of the night, but I mainly focused on my landlord. The police eventually left, and I made some tea for us, and sat outside with him as he cried on his face in the grass. He resumed digging the grave as I sat in silence with him till the light started to illuminate the dark backyard. He didn't leave his house for a week after that. So I was working in the office alone one day, as everyone was at lunch, and as I was working, I kept hearing the door opening and closing. It was an automatic door, so I went to have a look, but there was nobody there. So I just returned to my workstation. Once again, I heard the automatic door opening and closing. So again I got up, and I went to look, and again there was nobody there. Feeling a bit freaked out, I decided to go work in a different room. While I was in there, I suddenly heard footsteps coming towards the room. As I listened to the footsteps come closer, the room became very cold, and the footsteps got louder and closer, and I was scared, and I felt someone behind me. It felt like someone was about to touch me, and I was too scared to turn around. I was too scared to turn around and see what was going on, turn around and see who was behind me, but I felt them there. And I just blurted out, "Whatever you want. I haven't got it, so please go away." For a few moments I still felt it. I still felt someone behind me. It was still cold. But then suddenly, I heard the footsteps start up again. Although this time, the footsteps were retreating. They were going in a different direction. As they retreated, the cold also left the room. I waited until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. Then I got up and left the room. And then I left the building. And I did not go back inside until somebody else came back to the office. I grew up in the deep, dark, feathery pines of the Appalachian Mountains. I've heard of these people my whole life. But to hear of someone and to actually experience them are two different things. It was Sunday afternoon in July. We rode on the truck bed home from morning church service because the bumps were as close to our carnival ride as we'd be getting. Sandwiches of dust and flies were held off only by handkerchiefs in front of our faces. It was blackberry season, and we knew we needed to get home and change into our work clothes. A quick lunch of cucumber and tomato sandwiches, slathered in mayonnaise, would hold us over into the evening meal. Grandpa was in charge of dropping us off near the lake to pick blackberries. His gray hair glistened with sweat as I watched him drive away. There were 6 of us, 3 boys and 3 girls. I was the youngest of all. Had I not whelped and cried to go, Mama would have, no doubt, kept me back at the house. But listening to women's gossip or men's small talk wasn't very interesting for a 12-year-old. I much preferred spying on my older brother and his girlfriend, sneaking kisses behind the briars. The lake was large and cool, reflecting the green of the trees above. So I followed the curve of the bend round to the old dock. It was strange that someone had left a rickety boat tied up there. I've never been on a boat, not even an old discarded one. So I slipped off my shoes, untied the rope, and jumped into the boat. It was only after I had pushed off from the bank that I realized there was no oar, and soon I was headed in the far direction of the rest of the family. At first it wasn't too scary. I figured I'd hit ground soon enough and the boat would stop along the banks. But that didn't happen. I tried paddling fiercely, but could only manage to go in circles. Now I kept my hopes up that Grandpa would come find me when he came back after the rest of the group. But dusk began to swallow the lake, and the light of day drained out into the universe. Hours passed. Eventually the lake came to a small cove. My boat sank into the squishy mud of the bank. I was tired and hungry and sunburned, and afraid of the dark. I slipped my shoes back on and began to trek across an unknown path. I knew I needed to stay away from the low, dense growth where the snakes slept. I walked for nearly a mile until I came to a clearing. I could hear singing and rejoicing, and I felt like joining in. I was so relieved. Approaching the small church cautiously, I can see the lights from the coal oil lamps flickering through the windows. I reached the door and turned the knob, and stepped gingerly into the church building. The air was heavy in perspiration and foreboding. A tall, thin man with nearly no hair at all stood in the pulpit. Two stouter men stood just below. They were opening a box made of wood with holes drilled through it, and the preacher called the name of a woman who was to come forward. I saw them in lifting up the serpent. As I said before, I had heard of these people, but I had never seen them. Up until that moment, they were somewhere between an enigma and a grand fairy tale. The woman took the snake and fell into a deep prayer. Undecipherable words fell from her mouth, like dry breadcrumbs. The man in the pulpit cast his eyes upon me, and I shivered, like someone was walking on my grave. Suddenly the woman cried out. The two stout men grabbed the serpent and hurried it back into the box. "Sinner!" cried out the beady-eyed, thin man in the pulpit. He slapped his hands above his head, making a sharp, loud noise, like the crack of thunder on a cloudless day, and with that everyone began to stand and pray, to move and gyrate and spill more undecipherable words. I stood frozen in the back of the room, my denim shorts slipping. A sharp, firm hand took hold of my arm, and I was led toward the man in the pulpit. He guided me to sit in a chair before the congregation. "Here now, people. It's a gift from God." The man spat through his whistle-shaped mouth and retrieved his handkerchief. The congregation seemed to settle down now with the man's words. I watched them pull the woman's lifeless body out of the door. Two other men rose and joined the stout man outside. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to find one reasonable person that I could tell that I was lost, and I just wanted to go home. But as I looked over the congregation, I realized there was not one reasonable, sane person in the room. I was quickly bound in ropes to the chair. A blanket showered over all but my head, for the purpose of modesty, said the tall man. A slender, tall woman with flaxen hair made her way toward me. She smiled. No one bothered to stop her on her way, so when she approached with the knife, I assumed she was about to cut me loose. But she wasn't. I felt the blade hot and deep go into my toes. That was the last thing I knew of that evening. I woke the next morning swollen and painful. My feet were bound in gauze, which only exacerbated the raw nerves. I looked out the dirty window glass. I could no longer see the trail I had come in on the night before, and the sky seemed even closer than before, and I felt a sudden need to vomit, and the flaxen-haired woman heard my heaving. Into the room she brought a silver washpan and stuck it under my face. I retched the last of my will into that pan, and thanked her for her kindness. Ironically, I wanted to ask why I was the gift from God. And if I was a gift from God, why did she hurt me? What had she done? And how much was left of my feet and my toes? Days passed. I had no appetite when they would bring me food. The heat seemed an indelible demon's mark on my fate. The silver pan still sat with dried vomit, making it impossible to want to take a breath. When night would come, the cool air was as welcome and fresh as a cold watermelon in the depths of summer. I could look out the window at the stars and try to imagine how the Big Dipper could look the same here as it did from my home. On this night, there was murmuring in the next room. I could hear the low, dark, symphonic tones of men discussing something serious. I crawled out of the bed in spite of pain, and I put my ear against the sticky hot door. The conversation made me swoon, and I had to catch myself from fainting. I hobbled back into the bed as quietly as I could. I crawled out of the bed in spite of the pain. I put my ear against the sticky hot door. The conversation made me swoon, and I had to catch myself from fainting. I hobbled back in the bed as quietly as I could. Tomorrow they would decide who would get what. My head, my arms, my legs, and whatever parts of me could be divided into more parts would go to the highest bidder. I was their sacrifice. By now, my family would be mourning my death. By now, the whole town would have given up on finding me. By now, no one in the world knew where I was, not even me. The thought resonated in my brain. I heard the evening shift into the night hours. The murmurs died down, and the lamps went out. In great pain, I lifted myself from the bed once again. I'm sure they had not expected me to be able to do this. The wooden window had no lock, but would be very difficult to raise. Every push was excruciating pain as I started over and over. I almost gave up when I heard the windows sigh with fresh air as it raised. First one leg and then the other, all trying to balance on my heels. I crawled out onto the wooden porch. The movement caused the blood to begin to seep through the gauze again. I was young, but I knew enough of country life to know the smell of blood could bring the worst of beasts out of the woods. Still, my chances were better in the woods than waiting to be dismembered in that house. I watched the waxing moon pitter-patter through the top of the forest trees. It was of little light, but delighted my heart at the thought of being free again. The backs of my legs began to cramp from walking mostly on my heels. I found myself on the cusp of an open meadow. The moonlight spilled into the grass as floodwaters do. I took a long, cool breath, knowing the surest way down was to roll. I remembered all the happy times we rolled down hills as children. This would not be one of those times. I braced myself not to cry out in pain and thrust myself down the hill. But by now, I could see the edge of the little church braced just beyond a group of trees. I wanted to crawl the rest of the way, but crawling couldn't get me there. It seemed funny how I could both feel so much pain in my feet, yet could not feel my feet at all. I remembered how my grandmother used to tell me about how brave her great-grandfather had been in the Civil War. She said he had lost a leg without so much as a swig of whiskey. It was then that I decided I had to be as brave as that long-ago ancestor of mine. I reached down and began to unwind the gauze from my feet. Half in pain and half in fear what I'd find, I began to tremble. Blue, bloated resemblance of feet lay at the end of the gauze. I began to cry, actual tears of relief. The flesh between my big toe and the next one had been cut deeply into the tendon, but I still had all my toes, and somehow knowing that gave me a strength I could never have imagined. I felt so very alone, so very young, but so very determined to make it out of those woods. I began to run, each step a thundering pain that shot to my thighs. I could see the little trail in the pale moonlight. Quickly, quickly, I coached myself. I somehow made it back to the boat, and found a long, broad branch for my oar. By twilight I could hear the voices of fishermen approaching. I floated, semi-conscious in the lake. From there I knew nothing, until I woke up in the hospital with my mother holding my hand. She looked gaunt, too tired and tear-stained. As the days went by, I began to feel my strength come back to me. I began to have normal thoughts again, about ice cream and tomorrow and the blackberry cobblers we would have in the winter. 2 police officers came to speak to me, and I told them my horrific story. Each day that passed by, I found it hard to believe they could find neither the little church, the people, nor the little cabin high on the hill. Everyone came to believe that in my delirium I had dreamed it all. My injuries were, no doubt, caused by some other sharp object, but not a flaxen-haired woman with a knife. As the years trailed like a thin smoke of distant fire, I believed the same. I'm 26 years old now, with a 2-year-old baby girl of my own. But just yesterday, I drove into town, and as I stood in line at the DMV to renew my driver's license, I heard a familiar voice. A tall, thin man, with not too much hair at all, turned and smiled at me. He looked down at his nose with his beady eyes, wiped the spit from his mouth with his handkerchief. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo Cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.